Hello, and thank you for joining us once again for this evening's research webinar after our short break for Easter. I hope you've managed to get out and enjoy the lovely weather. How fabulous is this? And the amazing news is it looks like it'll last into next week. So I, for one, am looking forward to a trip to a sunny Glasgow for our conference. So I really hope some of you will be joining me there. This is our penultimate webinar in this research series, and I must say that after having a month off, I'm really looking forward to it this evening. If you joined us for the early sessions, you'll have seen the first, maybe some or all of the first five, Gary Cook, Maggie Cooper, Jane Sozabowski, Ian Newington and Juliana Maynard have all presented. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, tonight's webinar, like the rest of the series, is open access, so they can be watched live for free by anyone who is registered. However, if you or any of your colleagues would like access to this or any of the other webinars later on, they are all recorded for future reference, but access to the recordings is a BNMS member benefit, and these can be found on our members page. So if you are a member, please spread the word about all the interesting and useful things we do here at BNMS. And if not, please have a think about joining us. BNMS is brilliant. I love it. So I would strongly encourage you to do so. Anyway, on to this evening's webinar. Today's presentation is entitled Experience of Leading a Multi-Centre MRT Trial and will be presented to you by Professor John Wadsley. I'm sure this subject matter will be of great interest to many of you. I'm for one, really looking forward to his talk. Those of you who remember our third, I think it was our third webinar back in January, I think it was then, that was delivered by the wonderful Jane Sozabowski. And you may recall that John then acted as one of our panel members. So John's based at Weston Park in Sheffield, where he's a consultant clinical oncologist. His clinical interests are in thyroid cancer, endocrine malignancies, and he has a particular interest in MRT, hence the subject matter this evening, and targeted therapy for advanced thyroid cancer. He's clinical director of the Sheffield Cancer Clinical Trial Centre, cancer specialty lead for the Yorkshire and Humber Clinical Research Network, and one of the NIHR National Specialty Leads for Cancer. He's also a member of the UK Thyroid Cancer Research Group and is passionate about the role research can play in improving patient care and outcomes. So as you may imagine, John's a pretty busy guy, and this makes it all the more impressive that he's one of those people who always responds to emails promptly, makes time to read documents which have been circulated and to comment on them. If you ask him to help you with anything, he always will if he can. So he's just such a great guy, as well as being extremely clever and knowledgeable. It's more proof if you want anything doing, ask a busy person. That's what I always think. So I've worked with John on the BMS Council and on the MRT Consortium. He's really great to work with, but his links, particularly, I've found his links with NIHR have proven really helpful, not just to the committee, but also in learning a bit more about that organisation and learning more generally for me about research. And his knowledge and expertise has been invaluable in both those committees. And he's based in my home county, as you may remember, Yorkshire. So he has that going for him as well. So as usual, John's presentation will last roughly 30 to 40 minutes. And for those of you who are able to join us live, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end in our Q&A session, where he will be joined by our panel of experts. The panel members joining him this evening will be Dr. Jan Toprogi, Dr. Glenn Flux, and Dr. Kate Newbold. And once again, I'll be chairing the Q&A session. So a little bit about our panel. Because the panel is really a great opportunity. If you've got any questions about running trials, we've just got the right people in the room. So we're very, very, very lucky this evening. Jan is a clinical scientist with a background in nuclear physics and currently supports the work of the radioisotope physics group at the Royal Marsden as a medical physics expert. In his current role, he's responsible for setting up, running and analysing dosimetry data from national and international multi-centre clinical trials, including SELIMETRY, Medirad and Inspire. Inspire particularly is one that will crop up again. The other panel members have been involved in it. It's a multi-centre UK prospective observational study that is investigating the use of radioiodine dosimetry to assess absorbed radiation dose in patients receiving radioiodine for thyroid cancer. Jan is leading the molecular radiotherapy team for quantitative imaging and dosimetry within the radiotherapy trials quality assurance group, and which is a centralised UK resource that designs and implements QA programs for all the NIHR CRM portfolio trials. Secondly, on our panel is Glenn This is Glenn with 2 N's, and he is Head of Radioisotope Physics at the Royal Marsden Hospital and Institute of Cancer Research. He leads a team of clinical and research scientists that provide support for nuclear medicine with a research focus on quantitative SPECT-CT and PET-CT for imaging and dosimetry for molecular radiotherapy. He's led the physics aspect of trials in the UK and Europe and is the PI for INSPIRE, the trial I already mentioned. I'm sure many of you already know Glenn. He has a tendency to get around a bit, and he also, in the nicest possible way, he also has the pleasure. He also has the pleasure of working with me. I've had the pleasure of working with Glenn on BMS Council and the MRT Consortium. And I have to tell you, if you know, you probably know this already, what Glenn doesn't know about dosimetry really isn't worth knowing. And he's also a really, really great guy. Finally, John's joined by Dr. Kate Newbold. Kate is a consultant clinical oncologist specialising in the management of thyroid cancer, also at the Royal Marsden. So we've got a Yorkshire speaker backed up by the whole Royal Marsden crew. So this is a great panel for you this evening. Her expertise lies in treating advanced disease with radioiodine, systemic targeted therapies, and external beam radiotherapy. She's a reader at the Institute of Cancer Research and leads on studies investigating the role of ctDNA and tumour evolution in monitoring and understanding the biology of thyroid cancer, including being chief investigator of the Nominate trial, which is a multi-centre trial study, and she's also chief investigator of the INSPIRE trial. So, as I say, a great panel of experts, and please use this opportunity to ask any questions of them generally about running trials at the end of this talk, as well as specific questions on the presentation John's going to share with you. So I'd like to really sincerely thank John and all our panel members for giving up their valuable time this evening to share their expertise with us all. As with last time, to keep things simple, we're using the Q&As tab. So if you wish to ask a question, please use this tab to enter it. Don't use the chat function because I might miss them. And if you can use the chat function for general comments, information and feedback. At the end of the presentation, I'll read out the questions logged in the Q&A section to the panel on your behalf for discussion. I'd like to finish by thanking our sponsors, SciTech, Curium and Siemens, who have helped make this evening possible. And I, for one, are really looking forward to hearing what John's got to share with us. So I hope you find this webinar interesting and useful, and I really look forward to hearing your feedback. So there you have it. Without further ado, I want to pass you over to Professor John Wadsley. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gilly. Can people see my slides?
Yes, that's fine. They need to be in present mode.
Let me just... There we go. Great. So thank you, Gilly, for a really kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here and share something of the experience that I've had, along with the support of members of the panel, I should say, in leading a trial in this field, which has its challenges, but has also been a lot of fun. So hopefully can inspire some other people tonight to get involved in one of these endeavours. So to give a bit of an overview of what I'm planning to cover, I thought I'd just start by thinking about why bother going to the trouble of doing a multi-centre trial. Then have a bit of a think about what sort of support is available to help develop an idea for a study. Then we'll talk a bit about study setup and what's available to help with that, then actually delivering the study when you're open. And I'm going to give the example of the SELIMETRY trial, which is a study that I was chief investigator for, let's say with the help of other panel members this evening, just to put this in context a bit and give a practical example of how this all works out, and then just reflect at the end on what I've learned from that process, and how I think we can use that to try and move things forward in this field going forward. So why bother doing a multi-centre trial? Well, I think we all have to admit that in our field, in molecular radiotherapy, there are loads of outstanding questions. Frequently I see patients and I don't know what necessarily the best treatment is to give or how best to give that treatment. So we can't afford to sit on our laurels. This is clearly a really growing area, but we can do better at individualizing the treatments that we give, and we need to do research to work out how to use these treatments to their best advantage. So lots of outstanding questions. What's the best treatment schedule? What's the best activity to use? When do we continue treatment? When will be best to stop and move on to something else that might work better? The whole issue of what the role is of dosimetry, and what about combination treatments using radiosensitizers or immunotherapy, DNA damage repair inhibitors, or in thyroid cancer, as you'll see later, we've been testing redifferentiation therapies. So loads of questions to answer that can be addressed in trials. Why does it specifically need to be a multi-centre trial? Well, often in this area, we are dealing with quite rare diseases, things like thyroid cancer, neuroendocrine tumours, and any one centre doesn't necessarily have enough patients to do an appropriately statistically powered study. So you may well need more than one centre just to collect adequate numbers of patient participants to be able to run the study. But also, wider than that, I think running a study across multiple centres demonstrates that the techniques that you're using are applicable more widely than just in a single expert centre that may have, particular expertise in doing things one way, showing that you can get results from a widespread of centres across the country demonstrates this is something that is applicable to all centres, and informs changes of practice moving forward. So what support is there to develop these trials? So there's a huge amount of support out there available, and this is not a lone pursuit. You need a team, you need good people around you, and lots of support to get these things off the ground, because it's a lot of hard work. So just reflecting on the support that I had when I was thinking about this SELIMETRY study, we're really fortunate in the UK to have a series of clinical research groups. Now, they used to be run by the NCRI, the National Cancer Research Institute, but are now newly supported by a new body called the UK Collaborative for Clinical Cancer Research. So that's only been launched very recently in the last 2 or 3 months, but we will hear more about them. Under that umbrella, there's a thyroid cancer research group that Kate and Glenn and Jan and I are all part of, and really they were very instrumental in helping set up the trial that I was involved with. Patient involvement is really key as well, and within our research group we're really fortunate to have patient representatives, and they're absolutely key to ensuring that the research we do is answering questions that are relevant to patients, things that are important to patients, but also really important to make sure that the trial design is appropriate, so activities that you're asking patients to take part in are reasonable and patients are going to be able to comply with them, but also in developing patient information sheets that are accessible and understandable. So really critical to have that patient involvement in your design. The NIHR have a lot of support available as well. There's the NIHR Research Support Service. So these are units that are based in clinical trials units that are free to access, and they can provide a huge amount of support, so the trial methodology and statistical support when you're thinking about putting together a grant application. So well worth accessing that. If you're running a multi-centre trial, almost certainly you will need to engage with a clinical trials unit. So that's an organisation that can coordinate all of the centres in your study, manage all the regulatory stuff, collect data from all the centres, and analyse the results. And then in radiotherapy trials, we're really fortunate in the UK to have an NIHR-funded group, the Radiotherapy Trials QA group. This is a fantastic resource that is there to support any radiotherapy trial in the UK that's on the NIHR portfolio, and radiotherapy trials include molecular radiotherapy. We've already heard from Gilly that Jan is sort of the representative within that group that supports MRT studies. And they've done a huge amount of work to help support this sort of work, and I'll talk more about that shortly. So, from my experience, you need to get advice from as many people as you can, build a strong team. And the absolutely key thing at the outset is to find what the right research question is and identify a primary endpoint that is both relevant and achievable. And that is challenging. It takes a lot of time and discussion and debate, but you absolutely have to get that sorted out at the outset. Otherwise, everything else is going to fall down. So we already talked a little bit about the RTTQA group. So as I said, they're funded by the NIHR and Department of Health. and they provide QA support to the whole portfolio of radiotherapy trials. And as I've said, there's specific expertise there delivering MRT studies. So one of the activities of that group has been to work to actually publish some recommendations about how we can best deliver multi-centre trials in molecular radiotherapy, particularly where we're looking at dosimetry questions. And so this paper was published 3 or 4 years ago now, but I thought it would be just worth running through a few of the key recommendations coming out of this paper that inform what we do. So I think the first thing is that it is really critical when you're doing a multi-centre study to have a QA program. So we need to be sure that from each of the sites, trial data is being collected according to the study protocol. That involves setting up standard operating procedures, both for setting up the sites, but also for running the study and particularly for doing dosimetry calculations to make sure everybody's doing things in the same way. Also really important to identify from the outset how you're going to monitor what's going on in the trial to make sure that everybody's performing consistently and doing things the same way. So site setup is absolutely critical. The RTTQA group often support this by developing a facility questionnaire. So that's sent out to sites from the outset to check that they have the appropriate staffing and equipment available to run the study. And also that the staff have the expertise needed to run the study. So have you got enough medical physicists with enough time to be able to do this? Do they have any prior experience with dosimetry, or are they going to need support and training to manage that? Have you got enough cameras to do the scans? Have you got calibrators on hand? And say, what are the training and support needs? Really important if we're doing quantitative imaging that we standardize the imaging acquisition protocols. So there has to be a degree of pragmatism here because there will be variations in what equipment is available locally and what staffing and funding might be available. So there's a balance between being pragmatic and realistic against wanting to be perfect. That has often come down to me trying to beat Glenn down from wanting to do 12 scans on every patient down to maybe doing 2 or 3. But you need to have a discussion within your team about what is manageable. And I think it's really important when we're talking about being able to access and get funding for imaging that we need really high quality studies that confirm that doing this extra imaging actually adds value and is worthwhile. So I think this endeavour doing research in this area is absolutely critical to us moving forward and trying to make things better for patients for the future. So we need to, again, to standardise the quantitative spec. So that means a lot of work in setup. So for the SELIMETRY trial, a team of physicists from the Marsden travelled around each of the centres and spent their weekends doing setup measurements on the equipment in those sites. So looking at things like volume sensitivity calibration, partial volume corrections, dead time characterization. I think from doing the SELIMETRY trial, we've learned a lot about this and learned that actually machines from the same manufacturer are surprisingly, or perhaps I shouldn't be surprised, but are reliably fairly well standardized. And we now perhaps rely a bit less on actually going around and doing the measurements and accepting that the machines from the same manufacturers tend to do the same, perform in the same way. You need to also ensure traceability of activity measurements and ensure that local radiation protection requirements are being met, obviously. And then finally, so not quite finally, but it's really important to think about the logistics of your data transfer, particularly if you're going to look at having the dosimetry done centrally. You're going to need to have your images transferred, DICOM data, test that before the study opens and you've got a real live patient that you need to get the dosimetry done on straight away. But also thinking about how you transfer the non-DICOM data about what activity has been administered, the timings of the administration of the scans, and all the additional information that you need to do those calculations. So you need to think through whether you're going to do the dosimetry centrally or locally. As I said, validate and check the transfer before the trial opens and you're doing it with a real live patient, and ensure that you can appropriately encrypt and pseudonymize to make sure that you can comply with GDPR requirements. So quite a lot to think about there. Yeah, and then finally, the dosimetry calculations. So before you start the study, you need to develop standardized methodologies. We used a central dosimetry hub, so in some ways that made it easier because the same team were doing the dosimetry for all of the patients in all of the centres. If you leave centres to do their own dosimetry, you need to make sure they're working to strictly standardised SOPs, and maybe aim to centrally review a proportion of those to make sure that they're being done consistently. You need to think about your uncertainty analysis, and whilst dosimetry we all agree is really important, we all have to accept that there is a degree of uncertainty, and it's really important that that's made clear and reported adequately. You need to ensure that there's appropriate QA of dosimetry systems, and training and QA of outlining. So when we're running external beam radiotherapy trials, it's quite typical to ask participants to undertake a test case before they actually open as a centre, to demonstrate that they can undertake appropriate outlining of the target tumour and organs at risk. And this is not something that we did in SELIMETRY, but it may be if in subsequent studies that we might want to do similar QA of the outlining to ensure that that's being done consistently and accurately. So moving on to think about study delivery once you've set up. So I think it's really critical to ensure that you've got enough sites to be able to deliver the study. So enough sites who are going to be able to recruit the patients and do the work. And site engagement is really key. Having regular contact and communication with sites. It can be helpful to have a regular newsletter to update sites on progress in the study generally, and meetings. So when we were setting up SELIMETRY, it was really helpful to have a meeting of all the physics teams at the various centres to thrash out what was doable in terms of a dosimetry protocol. And I think without having had that meeting and sorted that out at the outset, the study would have failed. Really important to think about what outputs you can get, not just from the final paper, but also writing papers describing your trial protocol, and also the methodology that you develop along the way. And we had a lot of outputs from SELIMETRY just in terms of doing the dosimetry QA work from the outset, describing how we ran a multi-centre trial. That's, I think, really important to get out there to the community for other people to benefit from running their own trials. And I think in all of this, communication is absolutely key, keeping people in the loop, making sure that people are up to date with what's happening in the study and on board, and really importantly, recruiting patients. So to talk in a little bit more detail about SELIMETRY, so this was a study looking at a fairly niche group of patients with iodine refractory differentiated thyroid cancer. So this is a group of patients who at the time had really very few treatment options, and those that there were quite toxic, a lot of side effects. So the idea with this study was to test an approach to re-establishing sensitivity to radioiodine, to allow us to give more iodine treatment that would be effective. So there was some preclinical data from experiments in mice that suggested that this might be possible, and some pilot data from a study that was done in the States. The illustrations here are from Alan Ho's study that was reported back in 2013. This was a pilot study of about 20 patients who were given a drug called selumetinib, which is a targeted agent which can re-establish iodine uptake. And you can see on these images, the baseline PET scan image shows only physiological uptake of the iodine, but the after selumetinib image shows that there was really good uptake in lung metastases, showing that being on this drug for 4 weeks had re-stimulated iodine uptake in the thyroid cancer deposits. So this was promising early data, but there needed to be confirmation and better measure of clinical benefit. And we felt there were some important exploratory questions, particularly around the value of dosimetry in this situation, and potentially looking at some molecular biomarkers as well. So, as I've said, the study was developed very much with colleagues within the NCRI thyroid cancer group. CT-RAD, which is another NCRI group that supports radiotherapy trials, were also very instrumental. So they run regular trial proposals workshops. In fact, as a quick plug, I was on a call with CT-RAD colleagues just this morning, and we're planning a new proposals workshop in early July. So that's something to look out for if you've got ideas about studies. That's a great place to take your trial ideas and run them by people who have run lots of studies, so including statisticians, methodologists, clinicians, physicists, and they can give really helpful input into your trial design and refining and improving your trial design. And that was really helpful for this study. We also, because the drug, the selumetinib, was being supplied by AstraZeneca, the study was also discussed at a workshop that they ran that was really helpful. And I was really fortunate to benefit from support from the Leeds Clinical Trials Research Unit, who were the trials unit who ran the study. So with all of those meetings and groups, there were lengthy debates about the feasibility of running the study, the most appropriate design, what the best primary endpoint was. And that went round and round several times until we got to where we, to the final study design. So lots of support from these groups. We submitted an outline application to CRUK, and that was so the outline application was accepted, a full application was invited, and we were finally successful and had some funding to run the study. So that was when the real work started. So we needed to develop this dosimetry network of centres around the UK who were able to run the study and do the dosimetry, and this was something that had never been done before. So this was the point at which we were needing to assess site feasibility. It was also complicated by the fact that we had two drug companies who were supplying us with drugs and had to negotiate contracts between and with both of those, which was somewhat challenging, but we got there in the end. So just to give a bit of an idea of the timeline of this study, so you have to be in this for the long run. The first idea was sort of birthed in early in 2013. We first discussed this at the thyroid cancer subgroup meeting. It then went to this AstraZeneca workshop, then a CT-RAD workshop. We put in the funding application later that year. The funding process, because it's two-stage, took the best part of a year until we were actually awarded the grant. Then the protocol had to be developed. So it wasn't until April 2017 that the first patient was actually recruited. And it took us a couple of years to recruit the patients that we needed. And then finally, we're able to publish the final results just over 10 years after the first idea. So it's not a quick process. So just in terms of what we found in SELIMETRY, so there were some challenges. Recruitment was slower than we'd hoped for. And in fact, we found a lower than anticipated rate of conversion to being able to take up iodine, so a lower rate than was found in the initial pilot study. So we weren't able to fully answer our primary endpoint, but nonetheless, I think there were still really valuable outputs from the study, not least showing that it is possible to do standardized quantitative imaging and dosimetry in a multi-centre trial, establishing the network of centres that have then gone on to help develop other studies like INSPIRE that I'm sure we'll be talking about in a bit. So, I think this has been developed a really important platform for moving this work forward. I did just want to briefly plug in my NIHR role, the Associate PI scheme, which I think is a great way of supporting delivery of trials that are on the NIHR portfolio. So this is a scheme whereby you can encourage a junior investigator at your site to work alongside the main principal investigator to support delivery of the trial. And there's a training program that they get supported through both online and with the PI that allows them to, they're then issued with a certificate at the end of the scheme to say that they've done this, and that's recognised by a lot of training bodies, like for example the RCR, and increasingly there's an expectation in trainees training portfolios that they'll have evidence of having engaged in this sort of thing. So the benefits of this scheme, so for the individual, the junior individual who's being the associate PI, they get experience of running a trial with the oversight of a an experienced PI. They learn about all the challenges and practicalities of delivering a study, and they get recognition for their portfolio. And there is an expectation that they're acknowledged in the primary publication from the study. The PI gets an extra pair of hands to help with doing all the day-to-day delivery work on the study, and all those irritating things like keeping the delegation logs up to date and all that sort of thing. But also, it's a really important way of developing the PIs for the future. What we found as well, by engaging associate PIs in studies, often recruitment improves at sites because there's another person who's really invested in looking out for suitable patients. And the trials units really like this as well, because there's again another pair of hands at the site that's doing all those slightly tedious jobs that sometimes get a bit neglected, but there's somebody young and enthusiastic who's keeping on top of doing that stuff. And it's well evidenced that studies that have engaged associate PIs actually deliver faster and recruit their patients faster. So if you are setting up a new study, worthwhile thinking about investigating that. It's very simple to register your study with the scheme. You could, if you just search associate PI scheme on the NIHR website, the details of how to do that are all there. So I guess just rounding up by reflecting on what I've learned from going through this process. So I think the absolutely critical thing is to build a strong team from the outset. And I was really appreciative of all the colleagues that I worked with on this, without whom none of what we did would have been possible. Seek as much advice and input to the study design as you can. So going to other groups, talking to other experts who've been there before, using the NIHR Research Design Service. Really important that you seek funding for all aspects of the study from the outset. So I briefly mentioned that we had hoped to look at doing some molecular biomarkers, and we weren't able to include that work in the original grant to CR UK because of funding limit issues. And we'd hoped that we might be able to then subsequently wangle some funding to do that at a later date, and that never did work out. So think really carefully about what you want to do and try and get it fully funded from the outset. I would say be wary of involving multiple commercial partners. That was quite challenging, negotiating between their legal teams with different demands. So that needs some careful thought. Be realistic about recruitment, particularly when you're looking at a rare disease where there are only a small number of patients potentially eligible. So be realistic about how many you're going to be able to recruit. And communicate. So the communication absolutely key all the time between sites, with the trials unit, within the sites, with the multidisciplinary team that's involved. That's all really important. And finally, I think persevere. So it's a long, hard slog, but it is worth it. But you have to keep plugging away at it. So just to finish, a few acknowledgements. So really grateful to CR UK who funded the SELIMETRY study, and the companies who supplied drugs, all the colleagues who worked with us to deliver this, especially the Marsden team, and the rest of the RTTQA group, and of course the patients who were willing to take part. So hope that's been of interest. I will unshare my slides and we can move over to some discussion.
Right, thank you so much, John. That was absolutely great. It was really, really interesting, and hopefully we'll get a few questions cropping up in the Q&As. Remember, please put them in the Q&As. I had a few prepared. So you mentioned communication, and I mean, obviously that is really key when you've got multiple centres. How would you maintain the sort of engagement of all the sites throughout the trial? So, how often would you have things like investigator meetings? What other sort of communication would you do, sort of updates or newsletters or anything like that? What would you suggest?
So I think it needs to be a mixture of things. I think there is no substitute for face-to-face meetings for getting things done, but clearly you can't be doing that all the time, because that means people traveling. I think I mentioned what I think was really instrumental at the start of SELIMETRY was having an in-person meeting at the Marsden, where we sort of thrashed it all out together in a day to start with, and I think that was really instrumental to getting things done. But then subsequently, it's not realistic to do that every month. So emails, newsletters, just keeping regular contact, keeping people feeling they're in the loop. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got a question for Glenn as well about you'll be surprised to hear, dosimetry. So as somebody who is not is the opposite of an expert in dosimetry, I don't get that excited look that physicists get. I get a sort of glazed look a bit when it sort of starts being talked about. But I'm getting more into it now after spending time with Glenn, obviously. So what sort of level of prior experience or expertise, particularly in dosimetry, is necessary for a site to participate? How do we get more people involved, or if they haven't got a lot of experience, how do they get it?
Thanks, Gilly. Firstly, I would say that it's very difficult to tell the difference between a physicist that looks excited and one with a glazed look. Kind of a bit of a natural thing that we have, really. I think there's quite a few people that have signed in here that have got experience of dosimetry. I would say there's no such thing as a dosimetry expert. I certainly don't count myself as one, but any more than there is for the treatments that we give. What we're doing, so with SELIMETRY, we set up with the help of Francesca and others, and we processed all of the data centrally so that at least it was all being done the same way, and we tested every camera. After that, we ran a European trial with some Horizon money in France and Germany, as well as the Marsden. And there we did less testing, and another centre, Toulouse, also did the dosimetry with us so we could compare. And now with Inspire, we've got 10 or 11 centres going, and we're very much encouraging local centres to do their own dosimetry where they wish to do so, which is, in practice, what we're seeing is kind of like younger trainees. It makes a really nice project for an STP trainee or for people to get into it. There's more software available now. So we're kind of stealthily trying to roll it out, because much as we like centralizing everything or to have a central check, we don't really want to do the nation's work. And it's very much, as you've just said, dosimetry is just one of those things. It's like so much. Just the more you become accustomed to it, the more you're just very much used to it. And it's a huge advantage here to have people like Kate and John, for whom, of course, dosimetry is not a strange word, because it's what they do in radiotherapy all the time. So I've never had to, with Kate here, sit and say, I've got this thing called dosimetry. So it kind of comes on by stealth, I think, a little bit, Gilly. But it's, in practice, it's something that anybody could do tomorrow. It's not a big deal. It's in my opinion, I don't know what you think. Jan, you can see it more objectively than I can, because I'm completely twisted.
No, I think it is, and I think we have seen it with Inspire now quite a bit, that we've been approached by like several of the sites who have sent us their data, their calculations, and said, "Oh, can we just check that we're getting the same magnitude of doses and everything?" And I think we've done it with 2 sites now, and we're getting very similar numbers out, which is really encouraging, but also not a surprise, because I think, at least in the UK, there's only 2 or 3 different dosimetry softwares that are around and being used and everything. We've all done the same site setups and everything. So no, I don't think it requires a PhD to do those dosimetry calculations or anything. It is really something that, and I think it does come in a little bit into the STP now, where there is, at least when you choose nuclear medicine, you at least do a little bit of the dosimetry as part of the master course and everything. At least when you do, if you do the KCL bit. So I'm hoping it's going to become more and more. And I think I've been involved in quite a lot of like EFOM, so European Federation of Medical Physics courses and everything. It does become a lot more, and I think there's a lot out there now where you can go on courses and just learn about it and just do it.
Thank you. One of the things I was thinking about was standardization, because obviously if you've got more than one site involved, there's going to be variations in like local equipment, in staffing, expertise and skill mix, and funding, and lots of different variations. So how do you make sure that the sort of imaging acquisitions and all the different elements of the trial are standardized across all the participating centres, so that we can really compare the data?
Yeah, I think that's my. I'm going to answer that one. So I'm working a lot with RTTQA, which is like the radiotherapy trials quality assurance group, and Hannah as well, who works with me. We're part of that. So we've learned a lot from radiotherapy, basically going into those trials. And we're basically doing a very similar approach than they do in the way of like really setting up a quality assurance program around the whole thing. So before we start any trial, we send out questionnaires asking for all of the information that even asking about the local expertise about dosimetry, but what cameras they've got, what equipment they've got, and everything, and then we provide advice based on that to kind of like set the centers up and everything, and then for any data that comes in, we do prospective reviews. So like any dosimetry data that comes in, Hannah, like our research technologist, checks all of the metadata that is in the images to make sure that the correct acquisition protocols were used, the patients were scanned at the correct times, and all of those kind of things. So we have kind of like set up a whole scheme behind it just to make sure that all of that is done the proper way so that we can trust the data that comes out of it. And like I said, I think RTTQA has been really, really valuable in there. Like, and I think John is obviously part of that as well. And it has been really good to get them involved. And I would encourage anybody who's thinking about setting up a quantitative imaging study or dosimetry study to get RTTQA involved. And then hopefully in the future, we're going to have more than one RTTQA physicist, which is just me at the moment.
I would just add to that very quickly. This is absolutely routine in external beam therapy across, countries and multi-centre. So really the whole path is there. The only difference, as John alluded to, is we have to make sure that the cameras work the same. And so what we did so far is Becky Gregory, Francesca Leek, who's logged in here, sorted them out in Europe. So we're still kind of in that process of seeing that the cameras kind of behave the same with a different make and model. But it seems to be there, which means one thing that I'd be very keen to do, sorry, this is going off on a skew, I'd be very keen to look at the potential to scan patients in different centres. If a patient doesn't is only in for like 2 nights, but they've got a camera in Wolverhampton or, God help us, somewhere in Yorkshire, then if they've got the same camera up there, why could we not sort of scan in different sites? I'm just throwing that out as a little pipe dream that I've had.
No, that's good, because I was just about to ask you about camera standardisation. So you've preempted me. Oh, we have got a question in the Q&As, which I shall jump to, from Luigi Allode. We have a lot of interest for industry support. We have a lot of interest from industry to support early phase MRT trials, which to some extent is easier as industry will cover a lot of the work. Reaching the threshold for being able to get involved in multi-centre investigator initiatives such as SELIMETRY is still quite challenging for many centres as resources limited. I may have missed this because I joined late, but is there anything else being set up similar to SELIMETRY where more UK sites could get involved?
Well, the thing that's running at the moment is the Inspire study that we mentioned earlier. Now, I'm not sure whether there's scope for further sites. Kate and Glenn are involved in that. I'll leave them to say that. But that's, that has, there are a good number of sites who are engaged in doing that. And I think that's been a really successful way of rolling out, getting more sites doing dosimetry. Glenn and I have been in discussion and head scratching about what the next thing is and wanting to do something bigger. No definite plans yet, but it would be great to have something where we're, what we'd like to be doing is systematically collecting some dosimetry data from all the therapies that we do and comparing that with patient outcomes to just again prospectively confirm the value of doing the dosimetry and show that it makes a difference.
Thank you. I've got a question.
Kate, you should have a think, because your CI on the Inspire trial, and we are just recently been talking about kind of, this is wrapping up very nicely because we have really recruited well, but I don't know, could we do more sites next time round, do you think?
I think we've reached the limit of our sites now, because we're approaching the target recruitment. So we don't want to for centres to spend time in setup and then say actually we've reached the agreed amount number of patients now. But yeah, so it will be the kind of next phase of studies that we'd be very keen to involve more centres if there's interest there.
It's interesting you mentioned recruitment, because I was about to ask you about expectations regarding recruitment rates, and what support might be available if in one centre recruitment's slower than anticipated. Is there anything that is sort of can be done for that, or is it just sort of leave it to the local people to do what they can?
So, I mean, I'd be interested. Kate probably, I think, almost certainly did recruit the bulk of the patients to the SELIMETRY trial. So it'd be interesting to hear her comments on how she managed that. But there are numerous potential challenges. I mean, one thing is just not seeing the patients who are suitable, but then all sorts of other issues around research nurse availability, funding, access to cameras, and all those sorts of things. But Kate, be really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
I don't think there's been one academic study that we have led that hasn't been slower than expected in recruitment to start with, because it takes centres a while to get warmed up to the process in a way, and so continual communication, we have kind of drop-in dial-in sessions is really helpful, because part of the thing is keeping it in the minds of the clinicians who are seeing the patients, so that when they're going, they remember, yeah, well, this is obviously a patient that we would consider for Inspire, for example, because it's very easy in all of our massively busy stretched clinics to just keep getting to the end of the clinic, and remembering that there's a trial to consider is difficult. So I think, again, just constantly reaching out and talking to the local investigators, and on the clinical side, the clinicians as well, really helps in that situation.
Thank you. I was thinking, when Jan was talking about the QA aspects of the trial and checking the data, are there any processes that need to be in place to make sure that I always remember when I was involved in general imaging, we talked about transferring data. How do you validate that data transfer to make sure that those processes are robust before you start on the trial?
Yeah, so I think I don't remember what we did for SELIMETRY. Actually, no, I think we used the NHS transfer service, but so for Inspire, we have been using the RTTQA data transfer platform. So it's something that is being used for hundreds of trials for radiotherapy. But I think for all of the sites before they came online, we have done a dummy run basically with phantom data. So some either anonymized patient data, but no, I think in all cases, I think it was actually just phantom data. So something, just trying to upload that sites learn how to upload the data, we download the data, and we validate that all of the data that we need is in there. So I think, especially with the dosimetry data, it often happens that some of the DICOM tags, so some of the kind of like metadata gets lost in the process of anonymization. So we need to know exactly when they got scanned with respect to the injection time and all of those kind of things. So it's really important to check the data transfer before, because otherwise you can't do the dosimetry afterwards if you have lost some of that information. But yeah, so for Inspire, what we did is really do like a dummy run with each of the centers, and I think that has worked really well to then go back to them and say, you need to adjust your anonymization protocol to not exclude this or that data. And yeah, I think that worked really well.
Okay, thank you. Would you expect the medical physics input to, what sort of level of input would they, and expertise and sort of experience would you expect in terms of medical physics support, or is that something that you're able to help with? Is it something that because Marsden, you're very experienced, it's a big centre, and what I'd really like to see, and I think I'm sure all of us would be to see more centres getting involved in trials, and I think it is a bit daunting. And I mean, obviously there's going to be some, the smaller centres, it may not be appropriate, so it probably does lend itself to the slightly larger centres, but in our at UHB in Birmingham, and I work in the radiopharmacy, we're trying to develop move into doing more clinical trial work. But the whole governance arrangements around trials is quite daunting, and I don't know what your local sort of internal governance sort of R&D colleagues are like, but it can be quite sometimes a bit difficult to navigate. Is there any support that we can give to people who are trying to get started but finding it a little bit difficult?
This has been very much the learning curve with Inspire, and this is what we had in mind, which followed on from SELIMETRY, because it was great that ran, but we were very keen to keep the ball rolling. This is all, we're still on a learning curve here. I mean, none of this has been done anywhere as far as I'm aware. What we're kind of aiming at, I think, is that we will support local centres to whatever degree is necessary. So if somewhere, say Birmingham, really wanted to come on board, fantastic. And we would do everything that we could to work with them and try and get them to be, to run it all themselves. But then, as you say, smaller centres might not even have a physicist, but they could still take part in clinical trials. So, really, there's no reason why any centre could not take part in a clinical trial. We've got some really nice trials people here that talk to the local trials units that are used to running them, which works very nicely. I mean, there are a couple of problems at the moment, not least that we're trying to do dosimetry, which is still not actually reimbursed by the NHS. Despite the fact that it's a legal necessity, it doesn't actually get paid for. So there's all sorts of politics involved, and we're fighting industry all the time because they're kind of completely opposed to a lot of this. But I think there's an enormous opportunity. And the one thing I really would like to say, if I get this chance to kind of rant for just one more minute, we don't really know what we're doing, right? We don't know what we're doing or why we're doing it. This is new turf, and we're getting hold of these radiation doses for patients, and there's a whole stream of different patients with different presentations, and there's not, we've got this really simplified little thing at the moment with all our therapies where everyone gets, I don't know, like 100 millicuries or 200 millicuries. I very much believe that needs the whole community to kind of, muck in and think about the hypotheses about how we can use this information. What we've done so far is we've found out how to get the information in, and that would work for any centre in the UK. What we're going to do now is to work together as a community to try and think about how we use that information to have better outcomes. Which is a bit ideal to kind of.
I think that, so I'm sure, Sabina set up the BNMS research group, and part of the idea of that was to try and bring together experienced and newer researchers so we can sort of provide some mentorship. So that's maybe one thing.
So
I did
Gilly,
wonder...
just to chip in. So I mean, I absolutely agree with everything Glenn said, but coming back to, I think what you were raising was challenges with R&D departments in different organisations. I think we do have to acknowledge is challenging, and not everybody has the R&D capability and capacity that the Marsden do, for example. So there is work, and that's where the NIHR comes in building capacity and capability for places to do this research. There's a lot of high level government pressure on us setting up studies more efficiently, and quite a lot of processes going on to try and improve the efficiency of doing that. So hopefully over the next few years it will become easier for centres to engage and get the studies set up, not just in medical physics departments, but using that R&D infrastructure to get all the approvals done. But it is quite hard work at the moment.
Yeah, that's been our experience for sure. You mentioned NIHR. So what kind of support is available from groups like NIHR, clinical trial units, maybe the RTTQA for people starting to do trial work?
So, well, I mentioned the NIHR Research Support Service, which is really valuable, and that's a free service. If you just Google it, you can find out. So there is a series of trial centres that provide a sort of consultancy service, and will provide really valuable advice about, you go with an idea and they sort of talk you through how to refine that, getting patient input, thinking about where to submit a grant application, all that sort of thing. So they're really invaluable. Most teaching hospitals certainly will have R&D departments with support available as well internally, and it's just worth talking to colleagues locally who've been there and done it, and maybe willing to mentor you through that. And then the research groups that I mentioned, the ex-NCRI, now UKCCR groups, are really valuable places. So the likes of CT RAD and their trial proposals meeting, where you can go and take an idea and get a whole bunch of experts to give you advice about how to refine that. So there is lots of support available if you go looking for it.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's all my questions. And we haven't had haven't got another one in the Q&As. So we're coming to the end of our hour anyway. I just have to thank you all for a really great presentation. Really thank you to John particularly for putting that together for us, but also to all our panel members for your input and your giving up your time for what's been I found it a really interesting Tuesday evening hour. So we have one more of these webinars in this series of research webinars, and that will be the second Tuesday in June. I believe it's the 9th of June. I should have probably looked this up. No, it's the 10th of June, and that is being presented by Jennifer Young, who many of us will know, and I'm sure that will be another really great talk for us to look forward to. As I said to you earlier, the BNMS conference is starting on Sunday. Well, it starts on Monday, but there's a pre-conference members event on the Sunday evening up in Glasgow. It's not too late to register, I don't believe. There are people you can register on the day or before. If you're not already going, it's going to be, I've seen the programme, it's going to be a fantastic meeting. Lots of opportunities to talk about MRT, lots of opportunities to talk about research, lots of people to get to corner and ask lots of questions of. I'm sure a few of us will be there. Well, obviously I'll be there. I've kind of got to be. So I'm really looking forward to that. I really hope to see a few of you there. And finally, so thank you all for joining us. And I think that is about everything for this evening. So I'll say thank you and good evening. Enjoy the rest of your time.